Hey everybody, welcome to episode 33. Let me try that again. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 33 of my Musical Moments series. Today we are talking about, well, actually today, I make good on a promise. Several months ago I did a video called Guilty Pleasures, which was about sort of films that I loved that were about classical music, even though maybe not the most historically accurate. Check it out right there. If you haven't seen it already, I'll put the link below so you can watch it next if you haven't seen it. And in that, I talk about some of my favorite films, Mr. Holland's Opus, and especially The Competition. Amy Irving and Richard Dreyfuss play pianists. Not a very good movie, but it's kind of trashy. I love it. What can I say? But in one of the comments to that video, a viewer said, hey, how could you not have included Immortal Beloved when talking about guilty pleasures of classical music films? I replied to that comment and said, don't worry, Trip Finnegan. I will be doing an entire video just about movies about Beethoven. And here, at long last, is that video. So today, I talk about 4 movies about Beethoven. I am your consumer guide. So let's get started. So that's right, today we are talking about 4 films that feature Beethoven. And so let's see, I had seen many of these, but not all of them, but I did a little Beethoven movie film festival this last weekend. I watched all these again just so they were all fresh in my mind. And it's my pleasure to share a little quick take through all of these. I don't want this video, this is not the dissertation on Beethoven in film. But I did do the research. I Googled it up and looked for things. It did not initially go as expected. But then I sat down, had my own little private Beethoven Film Festival, watched all of these, and I will give you my quick take on what each of them has to offer. And each of them does have a little something to offer. So we start with a film from 2006. This movie is called Copying Beethoven, and Beethoven is played by Ed Harris in this. This is a dramatization of the build-up to the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in 1824, about 3 years before he died. And in this, he needs a copyist to help him write out the parts, etc. No one wants to work for him because he's a kind of obnoxious blowhard. So in this, one of the local music schools sends him the best student to be his copyist for this performance. And this best student turns out to be a lovely young lady, and they have sort of this, it's not really a love affair, there's no sex in it or anything like that, but they have this sort of daughter-father relationship, mentor-student, but he's also very possible to deal with, of course, and he's obviously at a different, very different stage in life. We should say this is complete fiction. We actually know who wrote the parts for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It was 2 people. They were both men. And so this is all made up. And truth be told, I really didn't want to enjoy this movie because I knew it was so heavily fictionalized. I'd seen it way, way back, but wasn't that impressed with it at the time. I will say I found it a little bit charming this time. To kind of give you a vibe, to kind of give you a sense of the vibe of it. He does say to her once, "You are God's secretary," referring to himself, of course. And that's kind of the vibe of it, but there was a certain charm and really trying to humanize Beethoven, which I appreciate the effort and certainly the excitement around the symphony. And of course, famously, Beethoven is completely deaf by this time, so he can't hear the orchestra, and in theory, she was sort of hidden there in the orchestra, I'm not sure how, and kind of giving him the beat so that he could kind of keep the orchestra together. There is a very famous story where the audience bursts out into applause at the end of the Ninth Symphony, and he can't hear them, of course, until someone turns him around and he sees them all applauding. And it had been a long time since he had written a symphony. And they do a nice job of sort of talking about the groundbreaking nature of the symphony, just the fact that it includes a chorus. And lastly, his living quarters, which are kind of a big mess. I think they capture that pretty well. So that part of it, again, I found it a little bit charming, more than I had in my first viewing of it. But I think we can do better. Now for my next film that I'm going to talk about, this is by far the most recent. It just came out last year, and this is called Louis van Beethoven. And if you haven't heard of this movie, full confession here, it's actually in German, but don't stop. I have to admit, I didn't even know it was in German when I started watching it. And I thought, well, I really want to make this English films only, but I had kind of committed at that point. So I thought, well, I'm going to watch it. And there's certainly some very interesting things in it. One of the things I liked about it is that it shows Beethoven at 3 different stages in life. So you have Beethoven the younger, when he's like 8, 9, and 10. You have Beethoven right when he's a young man, and he is off to go to Vienna to study. And then he has Beethoven much older as well. So you get to see kind of these 3 things, and they're told concurrently, which I like the storytelling device, and I think it's done pretty effectively. There is a very famous story. This is true. Beethoven was sent from Bonn, where he grew up, which is kind of in the country in Cologne, and Beethoven is sent to Vienna to, in theory, meet Mozart and get him to be your teacher. And as far as we know, this did actually happen. We have pretty good reports that he met Mozart at his apartment, played for him. Mozart was impressed and supposedly even said to his wife, Constanza, you're going to hear great things from him. Beethoven was supposed to be in Vienna for 6 months for this study. Unfortunately, his mother took very, very ill after Beethoven was only there for 2 weeks, so he really didn't have much time to study with Mozart, so he had to go home at that point. He does, of course, come back to Vienna later, studies with Haydn a little bit. But for me, the best part of this, even in spite of the fact that I had to read all these subtitles, not a huge deal. There is this great dramatization of when Beethoven and Mozart meet, and in one of these scenes, he goes and finds Mozart playing billiards with the Italian Da Ponte, who's the librettist who wrote the 3 great operas of Mozart with him, and they're actually writing Don Giovanni at that moment, so he's giving lyrics to Mozart, who starts composing immediately in his head, and that's kind of great. I kind of love that part. And then they leave there, and there's this great exchange between Mozart and Beethoven when Mozart says to him, if you ever dare to write an opera, make sure you have a great libretto. But Beethoven says, oh, well, have you ever heard of Goethe? And Mozart, without missing a beat, says, well, does he write comedies? And Beethoven says, no. And Mozart's like, it's a shame. People like comedy. And so I found that to be really, really charming. He does meet later Haydn in this as well, but not quite as much to say about that. But for me, it was worth watching just for that totally fictional account of Beethoven and Mozart kind of hanging out. Oh, and there's this great scene where Mozart attends a performance of Beethoven where he's playing a piece of Mozart's, and Mozart interrupts the performance and goes up and plays a tune and asks Beethoven to improvise on this tune. Beethoven was famous for how well he could do this. At parties and things, people would give him a tune and he would improvise on it brilliantly, brilliantly. And I always say in the best examples of Beethoven's music, you can hear him improvising. You have this sense that he is literally considering options as he's writing, and then he makes a choice one way or the other, which I love about it. So in the film, Beethoven doesn't hesitate and starts improvising on this tune that Mozart gave him. Mozart is so impressed that Mozart sits down at another piano in another part of the room, and the 2 of them start improvising on this scene together. Totally fictional, but I still kind of liked that. The next film that we're going to talk about is from 2003 and actually was totally new to me, so it's a really nice discovery. I just watched it this morning. It's called Heroica, and it's a production of the BBC, and it's not exactly what it's billed as. When I looked to see what it was and who did it, it's kind of billed as basically a full performance of the symphony. It's a great performance by a great orchestra, John Elliott Gardner and his Orchestra Revolutionaire et Romantique. Fantastic playing throughout, but it's much more than that. It's this moment in time and this dramatization of the first read-through of the Heroica Symphony by an orchestra, a private orchestra held by one of the aristocrats who was a big supporter of Beethoven's. And you get this sort of multifaceted look at what was going on in Beethoven's personal life, Beethoven's musical life of the time, and the politics of the time. So in the most personal sense, he was in love with a couple women in his lifetime, had a couple of marriage proposals out, and they were declined because he was a commoner and didn't have a title, and the women that he was piano teacher and composition teacher to, etc., they would refuse to marry him because of that. Because at that time, you didn't do that. It's not something that went on. And the other thing that's alluded to in here, and it's the only place I've seen this, is the fact that he went by Ludwig van Beethoven, V-A-N, which would suggest that he was a landowner. But actually, Beethoven's family was Ludwig von, V-O-N, Beethoven, which would mean, no, you're a commoner. And so his whole life he was kind of pretending, just by spelling his name differently, he was pretending to be a title holder. And this is very true in Beethoven's life. He never used the servant's entrance. He thought, I am an artist. I deserve to come in the front door. That's what he did, especially with families that he was very comfortable with, as in the case of this. That's captured beautifully. And then you have the musical time period where Beethoven is pushing the established norms of what a symphony is. The first movement of the symphony is as long as most every symphony ever written, just the first movement here. And so this is now almost an hour long, much longer than any symphony ever had been. And there's this great moment where Haydn comes kind of at the end of this, and he witnesses the last kind of movement and a half of the rehearsal. And as he's leaving, he says, "Nothing will ever be the same after this." And that's a very famous line that Haydn supposedly did say after hearing this piece. And Haydn actually says that this is the first time the composer has placed himself at the center of his composition. It is his own outlook, his own opinion, his own take. And that is a very powerful thing. And Haydn knows everything will be different after this. Again, we don't know in fact whether that was said, but certainly it's a beautiful dramatization of that going on musically, the old guard and Beethoven sort of pushing into romanticism. And then finally, this third aspect of all of the politics in Europe at the time. Napoleon was first consul in France and really championing the rights of the poor and liberty and breaking down the old social strata of the aristocracy and the working poor, and believing that there was a chance to kind of ruin that system with that huge caste system which you couldn't move between. And again, this is this tendency, the way that Austria and Vienna, they think is going. And so there's this great dichotomy going on as Beethoven, the artist, sort of pretending to be or taking on the airs of the aristocracy, and the crumbling of the aristocracy all going on at the same time. And so you have this almost documentary type approach to this scene where you see these three things happening all at the same time. Very, very effective and great performance on period instruments. So one of the great things is watching this orchestra play this, because you get to see the horns and the trumpets and the timpani, the flutes that they're using of the time. And it's fun to see those played for sure, which you don't really get to hear in other examples. So lots to offer in this particular one. And the last film that I'm going to talk about is, of course, as promised, Immortal Beloved. Here we have Gary Oldman from a film from 1994. The facts are that when Beethoven died, there were a couple of letters written to his immortal beloved. And in the film, his assistant and one of his students, Anton Schindler, he goes on this search trying to find who this woman was, because Beethoven had bequeathed his estate to her, but never really named who it was. We don't know who the letters were actually written to. And so Schindler goes looking for her. Schindler is a real person. Schindler wrote really the first biography of Beethoven, Beethoven as I Knew Him, it was called. I've read this. It's considered very suspect. Certainly Schindler portrays himself as a certain type of student in this, and Schindler portrays Beethoven as a certain type of teacher and person in this. So there's a lot of value in it, of course, a lot to be gained. But we also know that there's a lot of things which proved not true after the fact, as it's a very subjective account of Beethoven. But this is pretty compelling filmmaking. Again, even with Hollywood license, there's some nice things about it. The orchestra that they use for the soundtrack of this is George Solti with the London Symphony. Some amazing playing, amazing performances of the repertoire. The piano pieces are Manuel Ax and Murray Pariah playing, so those are beautifully done. They do use a modern piano in all of these, so you don't get what you get in some of the other films that I've talked about, sort of playing on pianos of Beethoven's time. But you can't argue the fact that this really is some great playing. So there's that, which is kind of fun to listen to. And the other thing I think this film captures really well is this Beethoven's personality, how he could be just incredibly mean and dismissive to people who kind of set off his temper, but then he kind of had a soft side too, and he would later apologize, just saying, I'm hot-tempered. And in my opinion, Gary Oldman does the best job of navigating those two sides. You kind of feel like, oh, there are people like that. And I found that the most believable of the portrayals that I've mentioned so far today. So the other thing I think that it does really good job of is bringing these aristocrats down to earth. And I think I've mentioned this in another video too about Amadeus, where I think they did such a great job of making the emperor there seem like a real person. And here there's this great moment where Isabella Rossellini, very late in her life, she's returned back to her native land after the sort of fall of the aristocracy in Vienna. She returns there and becomes just a regular person. And, she's talking to Schindler as he's considering whether she might be the Immortal Beloved. And she says to him as they're having a drink, oh, I like you much better drunk. And it's that kind of thing. I think he does a nice job of making these people. Beethoven's brothers, two of them are portrayed. Caspar died very young. The other brother, Johann, lived much longer. But you get a sense that these are all real people, and I think that part of it is well done. The other thing that I'll say is there's some really compelling images in this. And they go for the big picture, like the big idea that Beethoven is this total genius. And there's some artistic license in just how some of these scenes are presented. There's this incredible scene where as a boy he's sitting in the water and the sky is reflected. And again, not at all based in fact, but really touching and beautiful and striking. And I admire that they really went for it, for sure. And so although the film took a little bit of getting into once I was in it, I think it was pretty successful. Lastly, the final thing I will say is that all of these films, with the exception of Heroica, all of them make an attempt to portray Beethoven's deafness. But this film does the best job, I think, of portraying that and what that experience might be like. There's a very powerful moment where he's playing the Emperor Concerto as soloist. He's playing and the orchestra gets lost, and so he has to start again. And there's this moment where he starts to play and he can't hear anything. And for me, watching it, that was the most affecting portrayal of the deafness that he was suffering from. And I was really moved by that. So that's kind of my take on these different films. I hope you enjoyed that. All in all, I think we have two really, really good candidates. And that is, if you want sort of more a documentary, more historical approach, I think that the Heroica is a really great film, and that sort of snapshot in time, as I said, that sort of three takes, his personal life, his musical life, and the politics of the time, really effectively done. And if you want kind of the Hollywood version, it's kind of hard to resist. Immortal Beloved has a certain charm, and you can kind of really get sucked into the world there. It's very well done. It feels a little 90s, but I still thought it was well done and would highly recommend it. So those are the two highlights of what I think are four really different films and that have a little bit to offer in each case. If you have gotten this far in this video, I'm assuming you might be willing to like it. There is a like button below. Please do so. And if you've gotten this far in this video and you have not already subscribed, there is a subscribe button below, so please click that. And again, thank you for joining me for this adventure in Beethoven, and I will see you in the next video. That last note's a D.